The character of the Sages of Messianism is hierarchical and overarching. The point is that the GD of Israel, and by extension of us all, as heirs to the Abrahamic tradition, is that the Creator is a personal GD. That is, that the Creator is not a cold machine, ball of fire in the sky, spontaneous creation, but rather someone who talks to us when we listen to our hearts. The question then is, who is He talking to? Now that Moses is gone, the prophets are gone, the temple is gone, who's left on this side of the phone line? An overarching concept in rabbinism as oral tradition of the oral Torah is Yeridat Hadorot, the decline of the generations, the subliminal message being not questioning authority. Recall that Israel was a theocracy, not a democracy like Greece, wherein the sovereign is GD, not the people. For this express purpose, we'll showcase this from the text. The focus is the regard that the generation of the Amoraim, spokesmen, interpreters, had for their predecessors, the Tanaim, teachers or repeaters. The Tanaim were the rabbinic sages whose views are recorded in the Mishnah approximately from 10 to 220 Common Era. The Amoraim refers to Jewish scholars of the period from about 200 Common Era to 500 Common Era, who, quote, said or, quote, told over the teachings of the oral Torah, which were eventually codified in the Gemara. The Amoraim followed the Tanaim in the sequence of ancient Jewish scholars. The Tanaim were direct transmitters of uncodified oral tradition. The Amoraim expounded upon and clarified the oral law after its initial codification. The quotation of interest is the following, quote, if the early generations are characterized as sons of angels, we are the sons of men. And if the early generations are characterized as the sons of men, we are akin to donkeys, unquote. Here we have a case where Rabbi Abaye asks Rabbi Yosef regarding the source of the ruling of a third person, Rabbi Yitzhak. The question is whether, quote, the ruling of Rabbi Yitzhak is based on oral tradition, Gemara, or on his own logic. Rabbi Yosef replies to Abaye with, quote, what practical difference does Rabbi Yitzhak's source make to us? To this, Abaye responds in turn by citing a well-known adage in Gemara, quote, when you study Gemara, is it merely like a song? He further elaborates his position that the material studied in the Gemara isn't like a song, that, quote, it is proper to investigate all aspects of the statements of the sages. The impression I get is that Rabbi Yosef is for blind tradition, whereas Rabbi Abaye is more open to logical argument. Rabbi Yitzhak plays the role of opening the discussion. In the previous quotations, we've gotten a glimpse of the minds of the rabbis regarding handed-down tradition and contributions from later generations. Herein, we'll see that this handed-down tradition only goes as far as the Mishnah in the Gemara of post-temple times. That is, there's a discontinuity regarding prophecy. In temple times, with the priesthood in charge, the liaisons between GD and the priesthoods were the prophets. But all this suddenly ended with the destruction of the temple and the disappearance of the priesthood. The question now is, whence prophecy? Where did it go? There are no more priests without a temple and no prophets either. Is the lifeline with GD broken? No. It must have passed on to the sages of the Talmud. This is the issue addressed here in this passage. The claim being that the sages of the, quote, oral tradition are the heirs of prophecy. This being the case, in an a fortiori argument, the, quote, oral tradition must be the, quote, oral Torah. That is, that, quote, from the day the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to the sages, unquote, of the Talmud. Furthermore, the belief being that a, quote, a sage is greater than a prophet, unquote, as interpreted from Psalms 90:12, wherein it says, quote, and a prophet has a heart of wisdom. The conclusion that rabbinism reaches is that in the absence of prophecy of the prophets, the next in line would be the wise men of wise hearts, namely the sages. Their logic is not worth discussing, since it is so biased with sages in the role of judge, and jury. In this passage, we see the reverence that students felt or should observe regarding their teachers of the hierarchy. Namely, the student is prohibited to issue a ruling in the presence of his teacher out of deference. This notion doesn't come from the Bible Torah teaching, not even from the Nevi'im prophets. Rather, it comes from the Ketuvim writings, as in Proverbs 21:30. The reference quotation in our terminology is Counsel P, Understanding R, Wisdom D, and Lord S, claiming identity of oral tradition as proxy with the Lord S, hence characterizing later generations in the category of possessors of the triad of Counsel P, Understanding R, Wisdom D. The penalty for violating the hierarchical sequence is the death penalty in the hands of heaven. In this passage, the quotation is directly from the Torah Bible in Exodus 33:7. The question here is, who is to be considered to be a, quote, seeker of GD? The comparison made is with the times of the wandering in the desert of the tabernacle and the Mishkan, the tent of meeting, which was believed to be the portable dwelling place of GD. Here, the seekers who actually entered the tent of meeting were only Moses, the prophet, and Aaron, the high priest. And then only when called, or during specific times like Rosh Hashanah, New Year, or Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. The argument is that the tent was far from the living quarters and that the faithful would travel far, relatively speaking. If such is the case, this would make the sages equally seekers of GD insofar as they too, as Torah scholars, traveled long distances to study and teach the Torah, going from city to city and from Israel to Babylon. With the above quotations from the Babylonian Talmud, the case is made of the transition from the generations previous to the writing of the Mishnah repetition and commentaries of the Gemara study from an Aramaic word and eventual codification in the Talmud study from a Hebrew word. By the way, there are actually two codifications, namely the Bavli, written in Babylonia, and lower on the cycle scale, the Jerusalem, written in Eretz Israel. The question now remaining before us is regarding the passage of this tradition from the year 500 Common Era to present times, 2020 or 2000. The list is long, though solely consisting of 4 groups spread out dependent on historical events. Quickly, they are the Saboraim, reasoners, from 500 to 630, all are Common Era. The Gaonim, splendors, 630 to 1100, the Rishonim, first ones, from 1100 to 1500, and finally the Aharonim, last ones, from 1500 to present. While going any deeper is beyond the scope of this article, we will nonetheless illustrate our point by choosing 2 landmark persons who are the most often quoted and holding greatest recognition in the tradition in general. These are Rashi and Maimonides. Rashi is an acronym which means Rabban Shel Yisrael, Rabbi of Israel, or as Rabbeinu She Yiryeh, our rabbi, may he live. His real name was Shlomo Yitzhaki, Solomon Isaaci, from February 1040 to July 1105. His works remain a centerpiece of contemporary Jewish study. His commentary on the Chumash Pentateuch of Moses serves as the basis for numerous commentaries by the greatest names in rabbinic literature, which analyze his choice of language and citations. He is a point of departure for all other commentaries on the, quote, oral tradition. He lived in France and was Ashkenazi. Moses Ben Maimon, more commonly known as Maimonides or else as Rambam with an M. He was a medieval Sephardic Jewish philosopher who became one of the most prolific and influential Torah scholars of the Middle Ages. Born in Cordoba, Almoravid Empire, present-day Spain, in 1138, he worked as a rabbi, as a physician, and a philosopher in Morocco and Egypt, dying there on December the 12th, 1204. He is sometimes known as the, quote, Ha-Nesher Hagadol, the Great Eagle, in recognition of his outstanding status as a bona fide exponent of the oral Torah. This takes us to our central point of highlighting his role in establishing both the, quote, oral Torah as well as, quote, Messianism. These are traditionally listed under the 13 principles of faith. The principles can be seen listed above. However, the omission of these principles within his later principal works, quote, the Mishneh Torah and, quote, the Guide to the Perplexed, lend support that these principles are descriptive, not prescriptive. Now, to wrap things up, we must conclude within the scope of this topic. Rabbinism seems to have it both ways. It is heir to prophecy, hence unquestionable, as continuation of the Torah teaching in oral tradition as, quote, the oral Torah. But the sages are about wisdom, not prophecy. They make no claims talking directly with GD, only communicating with GD employing reason. Their tradition is top-down, hierarchical, not questioning rulings made by previous generations of rabbis. This makes their reasoning dogmatic. That is, their reasoning is irrational. If they get the cornerstone right, then the world edifice is sound. If they get it skewed, however, then civilization grows twisted with cracks with each additional floor. But there is no way of revising the blueprints as we saw above with a closed religious theocratic system. The contradiction is evident in Bava Batra 12a 12-14, wherein it says, I quote, "These are nothing but words of prophecy," meaning, as per the commentator, quote, "I do not see the logic behind the statement, as if based on prophecy and a heavenly decree, spoken in the most general of terms," unquote. The problem aching rabbinism is no different from that stinging us today of dualism. This being the case, the question is, how does one transcend dualism and reaches a non-dualistic account of reality? In other words, what would a holistic account of civilization look like? That is the question facing the future of rabbinism as well as of scholarship in today's crisis-ridden world. The stakes are high for humanity, needless to say. Well, that's all, people. Yours truly, Rick, your Charro, Mr. T, GD Bless, Austin, Texas, capital of the world.